I'm Frederick Noyce, son of Elliot Noyce. The new film about my father is Modernism, Inc. You are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guile. Creating affordable, transportable, innovative prefab houses has been the holy grail of architecture for 100 years. And if you were reading Dwell magazine in the early 2000s, you couldn't miss their coverage of the latest adventurers on that quest. Joining us today is one of the most successful of those adventurers, Michelle Kaufmann, who's now with Google. Later, George travels to Stamford, Connecticut to talk with modernist architect Roger Ferris. And we wrap up with fellow podcasters Ron Melk and Kevin Kennedy of Your Valuable Home. And now, architectural psychologist to troubled couples everywhere, your host, Dr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. Today, a chronicle of cantilevered compromise. House hunting is that romantic, thrilling, soul-crushing endeavor that tests the mettle of even the most committed couples. But imagine a twist where your partner's taste in houses resembles a well-curated museum of chintz, florals, and porcelain dogs, thinking Laura Ashley, perhaps, while your heart belongs to the clean lines and open spaces of modernism. We're now in a situation where compromise will dance a delicate tango with your existential dread. One spouse, bless their hearts, views anything built after 1900 with suspicion one might reserve for a particularly pungent cheese. Too sharp, they declare, wrinkling a nose at the sight of a cantilevered balcony. And they need more drapes because apparently drapes are the architectural equivalent of emotional security blankets. Linus of Peanuts fame in a wingback chair. Most couples end up like truffle pigs, sniffing out potential compromises between Bauhaus beauty and Victorian coziness. Here's what they are going to find on that quest. Number one, a 1990s McMansion with a turret glued precariously to its forehead, like a misplaced tiara. Think modern castle, your realtor will say, his eyes gleaming with commissioned dreams on this overpriced monster. House number two, a charming 1920s bungalow disguised as a mid-century modern, with avocado appliances gleaming in the kitchen, floral wallpaper in the bathroom, and shag carpeting whispering promises of static shocks. For you, this is like dating someone who's had a little too much plastic surgery. House number three, a converted warehouse with exposed brick walls, towering windows, and enough steel beams to build a small bridge. As your realtor's voice echoes in this cavernous space, you're feeling a flood of joy, and your beloved looks like they are choking on a chicken bone. What is going to break this deadlock for you, the modernist spouse, in persuading your English major from Sarah Lawrence College, who has subscribed to American Bungalow since they were 10 years old? Well, the key to conversion is getting them to live in modernism. You're not going to win this argument through realtor visits or browsing on Redfin. You have to book a house for a weekend on HomeAway, VRBO, Airbnb, and all the other ways that offer a search by style. A long weekend in a modernist house allows the visceral experiences of scale, structure, and space to seep into the pores of your beloved as they wake up to the sun dancing around the room. Add to this any beautiful location, desert, lake, ocean, forest, mountains, and your Laura Ashley will soon be asking for a Dwell subscription. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of modern Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
We begin with George's conversation with Michelle Kaufmann.
Like Captain James Tiberius Kirk, Michelle hails from Iowa, where she was secretary of the high school art club. She later graduated from Iowa State, go Cyclones, and Princeton, go Tigers, and started her career pretty much at the top, working for Frank Gehry on projects like the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, that is. That museum broke the mold on contemporary museum design and set the standard for successful city economic development. There's even a name for it, the Bilbao effect, which every major city in the world has been trying to duplicate since, mostly unsuccessfully. Next, the affordable and sustainable home called Glide House she designed for herself and her husband led to an innovative, sustainable, wildly popular prefab business that got her in just about every architecture magazine on the planet, particularly Dwell. She completed more than 50 house projects before the Great Recession of 2008 hit, and well, that was that. After that, she joined Google's X division, what they call the Moonshot Factory, to work on the really difficult problems like affordable green building. And currently, she is Google's director of R&D for the built environment. I ran into her at the 2023 AIA National Conference in San Francisco, where she was speaking, and invited her on the show. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi, that is my favorite intro I've ever had in my life. I love it. So much color and realizing, yeah, it's been a journey.
It has been quite a journey. And you have fans, at least one. Our research team discovered that you have a fan site, MichelleKaufmann.com, but not run by you. It seems somebody else is running that, and it's a ghost town. It's empty.
I don't know what it is. I'm thinking maybe it's my aunt who did it.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I am unsure of what it is. I saw that as well.
Yeah.
A few months ago. I don't know what it is.
And down at the bottom, it says not affiliated with Michelle Kaufmann in any way. So
I think it's my Aunt Patty.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Well, we got to
But
get
I
Patty
don't know.
on the stick here because she's got some work to do.
I'll tell her.
Okay. You started out designing museums. Tell me about that.
Yeah, my first job out of graduate school, I was so lucky to work with Frank Gehry and Edwin Chan, who worked in his office, and I learned so much during that time frame. So much about just going back to first principles when you're designing something and how to think about designing from the inside out. I think a lot of people look at Frank Gehry buildings and might assume he just crumples up paper and designs from the outside in. And,
Well, The
and then
Simpsons taught us that, right? The Simpsons showed us that Frank Gehry just balls things up and things happen.
And what's fascinating is it's the exact opposite. He actually starts from the inside out, from the program, and we would make program blocks, and then it would be sculpting the experience of the space, whether it be the flow of how people would be moving through it, the way that light would be coming in or dancing around, and then the forms really come from that, both from the inside and then the outside. And I just learned so much working there. And now in hindsight, now that I look back at the arc of all the parts of the journey that you just described that got me here, there are a few common threads. And with the Frank Gehry work that I did, I also was heavily involved at the time. This was many years ago. This was when CATIA was first starting to be used by architects. And so at the time, in Frank's office, there were, I think, only 4 or 5 people who worked in CATIA because it's a fairly complex program and fairly expensive.
This is software, I assume?
It's software,
Okay.
yeah. And it came from aerospace engineering in order to make sculptural shapes. And so CATIA at the time was the main program that was used to normalize those types of shapes and try to normalize them into constructible buildings with as many straight sticks as possible and as many straight members and be really strategic with where you actually have curved members as a way to make it more affordable and a bit more predictable and a bit smoother with the shapes as well versus when you have complex curves and complex surfaces, because metals don't really like to do that unless they're formed in some way. And it was when Rhinoceros, which is also software, first came out, and I helped bring the Rhino program into the office at the time as a way to just make it much more scalable, that then many people in the office could be using that software And as we were digitizing models, many more of us then could be working right in Rhino to really think through the surfaces and help think through constructability. And so there was something about like a democratization as we started thinking about additional tools that then more of us in the office could be thinking about more parts of the process. And it was really such a fascinating journey. And I learned so much. I worked on the Hereford Museum in Germany, as well as a few exhibits in the Guggenheim, the Art of the Motorcycle in Bilbao and New York. And then I also was the project architect at the time of the proposal for the new Guggenheim for New York, which ultimately didn't get built, but it was going to be extraordinary. It was designed to be over piers 11 through 14. This enormous floating building that was going to be 100 feet up in the air with a number of these vertical cores that would come down for vertical circulation and structure and mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems, and then have a plinth that would be on the same plane as the sidewalk, basically a park that would be floating over these piers with this cloud of a building reflecting from all sides from above. And yeah, if you have any interest, I highly recommend checking it out. I wish it had been built, but it was on a path to get built. And then September 11th happened, and priorities, obviously, in New York shifted.
Sure. Now, were you and your office surprised at the worldwide reception to Bilbao?
I started at Frank's office right at the time that the project was being completed in construction. So I was there really during that time where Frank certainly was famous to a certain degree before then. But once that opened, it became a whole other thing, as you mentioned earlier, the Bilbao effect that I think no one really saw coming. And even Tom Krenz, who at the time was running the Guggenheim, I think he had this idea. I think he could see it.
Mm-hmm.
And he certainly helped prioritize and make it happen. But I think to the extent that it became this time when I think it was a convergence of more travel, it was a convergence of more information being shared globally, that all of a sudden it was this building that was so extraordinary that people would travel from all over to go to this place and go to this town. Plus, I think honestly, it was mixed with the people who live in Bilbao and their food and their quality of life and their really welcoming folks, that it was this convergence of all of these forces that made it into what it was. And yeah, for many years after that, people would call Frank and say, yeah, I want what you did for Bilbao. I want that in, Kentucky or in, Louisiana or wherever.
Right, because they're nice people and great food in Kentucky too, right? And so all of a sudden, these towns that no one's ever heard of want to have their own Bilbao effect, right?
Yeah, we want that. We want that. And what's fascinating for architects is you always want to be developing and thinking about the next thing and being creative and not doing the same thing over and over again. And it'd be interesting to hear Frank talk about it now, but I think it's an interesting place to be when people contact you like, I want you to do what you did there. I want you to do that same thing here. And sometimes even wanting like something very similar versus when you're a creator and a maker, you always want to be making something new and something different and something better. And it's a schism between those two things versus having a client come to you and say, I want that thing you already did 10 years ago. Can you just do that again?
Right. There's that tension between replication and artistic creation, right?
Yes, right. Exactly.
Well, after working for Frank Gehry, I first came across you when you were known for the Glide House, which you developed, and became very famous within us prefab fans. I mean, I thought you were the queen of all things prefab. You and Rocio Romero were like, the Cher and Madonna of your era for all the prefab boys out here. So tell us that story. How did you get into prefab and have it take off like that?
Oh, that was such a time. And there were certainly a handful of us, with Resolution for Architecture, Marmol Radziner, and Flat Pack. There were others. And certainly Dwell magazine was at the center of gravity of all of that. And I think that was in the industry and in the world, it was a timing of a resurgence of that. For me personally, it came at a time when I had just moved to San Francisco because I had just gotten married. And I had been working for Frank Gehry and had seen and really felt the power that good design can have over people. And then it was this complete dichotomy of looking for houses and something that we could afford in the Bay Area in San Francisco and finding nothing that we could afford and thinking, oh my gosh, like I've made really bad choices in my life. I can't even afford a place to live. And I'm an architect. Like, this is crazy. What do we do here? Do we move back to Iowa? What do we do here? And it was at this time when there was also movement happening on the software side in terms of digital tools, starting to get people thinking about automation and how we might be able to utilize lessons learned from lean manufacturing and a different way of thinking about production. And obviously prefabrication in construction and in buildings has been around for a long time. I don't remember who pegged this saying, but it still holds true. Prefab is the oldest new idea. And it was at that moment when there were so many people who were working on these kinds of ideas of how we could have great design, how we could have sustainable design that could utilize technology, could utilize mass production as a way to unlock this cost structure that just makes it almost impossible for many people to be able to build a new home. And I think I was just really fortunate to be at that time and to be connected with Dwell and like Allison Arief and Michaela and others, as well as then the network of other architects. And we really did become this kind of clan at the time. And we would just share things and we would like refer people to each other. And when we would get together, we kind of were going on a road show a little bit for a while. We were going to these conferences and it was really fun because we bonded a lot, even though in a certain sense, one would think like we're competitors, but that wasn't it because there was so much to go around and we were all just trying out different things that we would stay up late drinking every time and like sharing stories and trying to help like, okay, how are you thinking about this problem? Well, I'm thinking about it this way. And we all had slightly different business models and slightly different ways we were trying things. And it was reinventing and trying things of how can we really unlock this goal? And some of us were trying to stay just as architects and utilizing existing factories, utilizing existing general contractors. Some of us, like I did with MKD, we bought a factory and then we started doing some of our own construction. Some of us were trying to do even the whole thing, doing from soup to nuts of both the factory and the general contracting on site, and sort of different models that we were all taking and really learning as we went of what works and what doesn't, and for what kinds of locations, what kinds of designs, how can you still have variability, but still have efficiencies that we were really trying to drive towards in terms of costs. So it was a fascinating time. And as a part of that, something I really enjoyed was the storytelling of it as well. And having some homes be storytelling opportunities themselves. So we had a full-size replica of the house that my husband and I did, the Glide House, up at the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. And so that was
the 10 homes that changed America.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And so it was in that museum and it was up for, I think, about a year. Within it, then it talked about, and at the time, now luckily many people know about sustainable materials, recyclable materials, different ways of having heating and cooling that you could have in your home to not produce any carbon and have homes that create their own energy and be net water positive. But at the time, it wasn't really on people's radar. And so the home demonstrated these different systems. And so it became something beyond itself. It was more like a storytelling kind of venue where people could go in and think like, okay, I don't know why I feel good in this place. I don't know why, and start to adopt even ideas into their own homes as a part of that. And then we did another full-size, fully functioning 3-story home at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago.
Okay.
And so that was something that then became this model called the the MK Solaire house. And that was really extraordinary. So that was called the smart home. And it was tricked out at the time then with even more technology that people could incorporate to make an intelligent home. And we did that with Wired magazine. And then we also had a home in front of City Hall in San Francisco that was just in the plaza. And that was great because that wasn't just people who were going to a conference. It was also people who were going to City Hall to get married, or people at the bus stop, with maybe a little extra time and walking by the house. What is this? Oh, and then coming in. And this was, I think, in around 2007, maybe. And so at the time, then people would say like, oh, green home. I don't want something like made of straw or, some goofy thing that would look like from the 70s. But then when they would go into the house, they'd be like, oh, this is great. I would totally do this. So that I think it was a really interesting era. And I'm still very hopeful and very optimistic that utilizing technology, utilizing automation, I think even more so now as we're starting to look at the power of new types of technology. Certainly AI is going to bring a whole other set of data sources and processes that we can be using that I think will ultimately be able to help us, hopefully this time, really achieve the goal of making sustainable, beautiful homes accessible to everybody. I'm still a believer.
Well, okay. So a lot of people go to San Francisco and can't afford a home, and they just figure out where to live. You started a whole company, bought a factory. I mean, you really solved this problem in a very intricate way.
Yeah.
Now, one of the questions that I have in following all the different companies that you mentioned at the time, part of the press was, and part of the whole point of doing this was to be able to lower the cost of housing for people to make it more accessible.
Yep.
But one of the criticisms leveled against everybody was by the time you finally costed these things out, you might as well have gone to your local realtor and bought something. Yeah. So what got in the way of this efficiency and low cost that was going to be part of the dream?
I think there are two things. One is that there's this chicken and the egg aspect of, in order to really realize the cost savings that I still believe should be there, so you have to have enough volume. You have to have enough pipeline in order to make these things run through the factory in the most efficient way with no gaps, without having to reset a bunch of processes within that. And we see those efficiencies when we start looking at multifamily projects that use modular construction or use prefabrication. When they have enough volume, when they have 400 units going through at a time, then they can start to actually capture some of the efficiencies. But when you have single family, and each one is slightly different, and sometimes it can look like, oh, I'm just adding 2 feet because my particular property, that would make so much more sense. And why wouldn't I do that? And it can seem like, oh yeah, that should be not a big deal. But then it means you have to totally reset how the jigs are set up in the factory. And so it reduces the efficiency. Plus, there's always a weird thing when you're talking about single family homes of, each one actually takes so much time for the financing that might have its own levers, and it's contingent on when the local general contractor is actually going to have the foundation set. And so that can also throw things within a factory where if a certain house is supposed to be starting in the factory and going online on a particular date, but for all sorts of legitimate reasons, it needs 2 more months before it actually can start. That's a huge problem for a factory. Yeah. Because they've basically been holding that line for that particular house. And so you start to lose efficiencies there. So I think that was a fundamental problem that was hard to really overcome when we were each doing single family homes. And even though I think in total with MKD, I think we did something like over 50 homes.
Yes, you did.
Which was a lot, but it's still, that's not enough. And they were all at different factories at different times. And so it's hard to actually get the true efficiency of scale of being able to constantly have flow through. So I've visited a number of factories now over the years, and their flow through, many of them ideally have at least 3 or 4 modules being completed a day kind of thing. And so that's like a house a day.
Yeah.
if you think about like, a kind of average single family home. And so to have that flow through and have it be predictable enough and have it be that you don't have to totally set up different jigs, I think that's a tricky bit. So that's sort of the chicken and the egg problem. And then I think the second thing that makes it really challenging is every site is unique. There are very few sites that basically were like, oh, that's an easy site. It's flat. It's, you can get right to it. You could just do a roll set. No, every site is different. It might be the views are in a different area and slight topography. And oh my gosh, like enough topography here. We should have an exposed basement, or we should add a third story because we can then have views of the water, or whatever it would be. It means you still have to spend time with the local jurisdiction, the planners, the local general contractor. There are nuances with each particular site that is also hard to really capture the kind of scalability and the kind of efficiency you might imagine.
Right.
So I'm hopeful that the tools that might be possible as we start to leverage the potentials in AI and start to think about how that might be able to automate variations with things. If there can be ways that we can have a different way of modeling how many different house designs might be able to still flow through one factory, for example. Like, I'm hopeful that there might be ways to unlock both of those challenges as we look forward. I've even had ideas of like how, if we're doing like a multifamily project, is there a way for us to then add on a number of, let's say, townhouse homes on the line, that those might be ones that can be more predictable with certain sites, that then we could gain the same efficiencies of scale that they're doing for the larger development than for single family homes. So I'm still hopeful. I still remain optimistic about the potential.
That's great. Now, when the recession came along and you got hit pretty hard and eventually you sold the company,
Yeah.
what happened to all those designs? Did they still get manufactured? What happened to all the Michelle Kaufmann wonderful houses we saw in Dwell and other places?
Oh, you're so sweet. That was really such a hard time and so tough to have to close the company. We had employees that we loved and we had clients that we were doing homes for that we loved. And it was just a tough time all around. And certainly we were no exception. It was happening in
All
that
over.
era
Yeah,
of
yeah.
2008, 2009, in the housing industry as a whole. We ended up selling the designs of the homes to a company called Blue Homes at the time. And then they, I think, continued some of the designs. I don't know if they're even still around. I haven't checked in with them. I'm not quite sure. But for a while, they were doing some of the homes like the Breeze House and the Glide House and some others. But I'm not sure where it all eventually went. I shifted gears shortly thereafter, as you mentioned, started at Google X and tried to keep up for a while, but then just got so busy with the other parts of the new work that I was doing that I just have not made the time to keep up.
Well, that's understandable. If you're working on Google moonshot projects, it's going to take up a lot of your time, right?
Right. It has indeed.
So what kind of projects have you been working on for the last few years?
Yeah. So since 2015, 2016, that's about the time when I started working then within Google's real estate group. So I started in 2011 at Google X, which is the Moonshot Factory, and worked with a group of software engineers and was lucky enough to work under Astro Teller, who is an extraordinary captain of moonshots. He runs Google X. He's an engineer and an innovator through and through. And so he works on a number of moonshots. I was working with a group of software engineers on an idea of moonshot for architecture and how could we utilize technology to make sustainable, durable homes available to everybody. And then we did a spin out, a company called Flux. And our first client from the work we were doing with Flux was Google's real estate group. And at the time, they were starting to think, okay, we're going to do ground up buildings for the first time. Might we make a building configurator to help us have googly buildings, but for standard building costs? That was the problem we were trying to solve. However, in 2015, 2016, then our CEO at the time was Larry Page. And he said, look, if we're going to do ground up buildings, I don't want it to be like anything that currently exists. I want to help really move the dial of what we could do with sustainability. Because at the time, Google had only been in existing buildings and had just remodeled and retrofit. And so if we're going to actually go through this and do buildings and campuses from the ground up, let's really make them where they produce their own energy, they're net water positive. They really push the boundaries in terms of sustainability and help not only make great places for Googlers, but how could we then unlock things for the industry as a whole? And so that's when I started working within the real estate group and set up the lab, because we needed even a different process for working with Larry than a traditional process. We brought on not one architect, but two, Bjarke Ingels and Thomas Heatherwick, to work in collaboration with each other and with us, and especially with Larry, to think about what might we do. And we used the lab even as a place where when they would come to town, we would all meet there and Larry would ride his bike over. And it couldn't just be showing him renderings or plans, because then it can be a debate and he can debate anybody under the table. So we had to be building physical things and full-size physical things while we're trying to capture his ideas, and Bjarke and Thomas and the full engineering and design team coming up with ways to address these things and think about new ways of doing things. And that was a truly extraordinary process where there would be ideas, we would be building them, and then this fellow named Al Artiras, who runs the lab, he's a builder. It might even be an idea that, and this literally happened. One day Larry he's going to come over in like an hour. And Thomas and Bjarke and the teams, they had this idea like, oh my gosh, we've been thinking about these dynamic solar shades that would be PV panels, but on fabric that could produce the energy, but move with the sun to control the temperature within and be within this inflatable structural system. But there's too many moving parts. Oh, what if we did an idea of one moving piece and have a 20-foot by 20-foot fabric? And so they were messing around with a broom at the time. And they had this idea of another mechanism. And so then they ran it by Al, like, okay, do you think we could do this? And Al's like, I got it. So Al gets out the broom handle and duct tape and water bottles, and he basically puts together this mock-up that is 12 foot by 12 foot at the time, although it was representing what could be 20 foot. And we had it built, this whole like weird thing, but it worked. And so by the time Larry got there, we were able to have this prototype, and Larry could be like, okay, I see what you're saying. Like one moving piece, then one moving part, in order to have this solar fabric that then could produce the energy and moderate the sun and heat gain and glare. And that was enough then for us to move to the next level of like, okay, now let's think about how we would make this 20 foot by 20 foot and above us and within the inflatable roof. So that's just one example of this whole different process that we had to make in order to really try to move the dial on some of these super ambitious ideas. Because, and Thomas and Bjarke both say this too, when they're in the room, they normally are the craziest ones. They're normally the ones who are pushing the ideas, like the farthest out there ideas. And they both say this, that when Larry was in the room, no, they look like the boring guys.
Right.
Because he would say, okay, you're doing that. But then, and he'd pull out some sample from his pocket, like, oh, well, this is really what we're looking at doing at the space station. Or, he'll come in and we'll be talking about lighting, and he'll say, well, I read a 400-page report on the effects of blue emission lighting on our brains last night. And so he would always come in and have so much knowledge that he kept us on our toes and really pushed us to then come up with the designs that we ultimately did for the projects that are now both open as of 2 weeks ago. Our latest one called Gradient Canopy is open. And then the campus opened last year called Bayview. And they're sister campuses. So they're both in the South Bay. You can see one from the other. One is in Moffett Field, so it's on NASA land, and the other is in Mountain View on main campus. And there's 4 of these canopy structures that have the dragon scale skin on top, if you will, these dragon scale solar panels that produce the energy for the building. We wanted to make PV panels beautiful. So not just have a way for the buildings to produce energy, but how could we do that in a way where they're also beautiful? Really thinking about sustainability from the perspective of the human experience. So that was the lens that we always had when we prioritized what we were doing in terms of whether it be energy, water, health, et cetera. It was always from the human experience lens, which I think was a unique approach for those projects. So with the solar panels, how could we make them beautiful? And we looked around at the time and looked at products that were on the market or near going on the market. And there were either traditional solar panels that are not beautiful, but they're not, let's say, architecturally beautiful or architectural elements, you would think, but they would be productive. And then there were some that one might consider beautiful, like a lot of BIPV elements, like on fabric or within glass, that could be quite beautiful, but it was not going to have a responsible return on investment. And for us, we still we're a public facing company. Whatever we do, there has to be a responsible ROI. And we were thinking about that in terms of a 7-year payoff. And so we couldn't find anything at the time that was on the market that could do those things. But we did find this product that was not yet on the market, but it was a very small company. And we tested out these products in the lab. And then we thought, this seems good. Seems like it could be a thing. And then we did the next version and the next version. And so they weren't really on a path to being able to commercialize in a way that could work for our large scale campuses. And so it was one of the examples of where we used our power as a customer to say, okay, what if we bought 1 million square feet of this thing that is not on the market? Could that help you bring it to market? Turns out, yeah. If you buy a 1 million square feet of anything, it turns out, you can usually get it to market.
What do you know?
And so then that was enough. And so that was enough for then Sunstyle to buy the technology, because we weren't going to have this small company build that much of it for us. So Sunstyle then ultimately bought the technology and then were the providers of the panels, and we worked with them and did time escalation on them, because we were definitely taking a risk with it, like a product that does not exist. It hasn't been built. How do we ensure that it's going to last a long time, that it's actually going to be productive and effective? But it was one of the things that I feel so lucky of the job that I have. And I really love this company so much, and our leadership, that Ruth Porat, our CFO, and Sundar, the CEO at the time, when we made this decision, they're like, okay, this feels like one of the things that we see that there's risk, but it feels like the right thing for us to do and the right place for us to use our resources to take on a bit of the risk to help get this to market. So we have no financial gain in it, but make these, I think, extraordinary buildings that are quite beautiful. And now it's available to the market as a whole. That's a part of my job, is trying to find those opportunities to use our buying power to do those kinds of things.
You had mentioned earlier about NASA Ames in Mountain View,
yes,
which is really kind of Google's backyard, because you guys lease a whole bunch of it from the government.
Mm-hmm.
I just have to ask, NASA Ames is famous for its giant blimp hangars.
Yes.
And Google at one time was going to start its own little blimp fleet. What happened to that? Did that happen?
Right. Well, we do have a long-term lease on those hangars 1, 2, and 3, on that NASA Moffett Field property. And I think that there are different transportation projects, let's say, that are currently in skunkworks mode, various things. I mean, I think some are publicly known of, trying to think about aerial transportation in some way that can help reduce carbon emissions by making it efficient to not have to have roads, but also not to have a lot of infrastructure required that would create a lot of carbon for us to get from point A to point B.
Like a
and
blimp.
So those hangars,
right?
Like an airship,
yeah.
Or, like flying cars, or, different kinds of ways of thinking about alternative transportation in that way. And so those are good places for working on ideas like that, as well as places where we can be testing out many other things. And this is also one of the great things about Google, is like using problems that we have to solve for ourselves and trying to think about it in really different ways and push the boundaries as much as we can to then hopefully help the industry as a whole in various ways. And transportation is certainly one of those.
So I guess the answer to my question is yes, they're still working on it.
Yes, I think so.
Okay. All right.
A long-winded way of saying yes. I do believe that might still be happening. Yes.
Tell me about Google and 3D printing, because I've got to think that someone in your position would be looking at this very closely for the kinds of things that you're designing for housing, offices, all kinds of applications.
Yeah. So 3D printing, I think, has lots of very helpful use cases.
Yeah, they just built a
Certainly with,
neighborhood in Austin
yeah,
out of 3D printed homes. Bjarke was involved in that.
yep. And then certainly 3D printing for, I think sort of smaller scale things that would be so unique that it would be so expensive to build in any other way. I have to admit, it has been something that we have looked at a bit. It hasn't been something that we have pursued within our particular group, mostly because it still requires a lot of local resources to do it. It's not so unlike concrete, just being like poured on-site concrete. And so I think where it starts to get really interesting is if it can be using materials that might be waste materials or, certainly, and I think Bjarke might be involved in the work that folks are doing of like how could we build on Mars where there's only certain kinds of local material that we would use.
Certain dust.
Yeah. And so I think that there's a number of applications where 3D printing of buildings can be really useful. It just hasn't been something that, based on the kind of scale of buildings that we've been focused on at Google too, since we are still, mostly focused on workplaces and starting to get into neighborhoods now. It's always in more areas where we'd have like 5-story, 7-story, 10-story, 20-story. And so that's where, at least to date, we haven't gotten into too much of the 3D printing for those types of structures. But I can tell you another material that we're very interested in. If you have been reading at all about mass timber, which is this kind of overriding umbrella of different types of beams, columns, roof panels, wall panels that are all made out of fast-growing wood, smaller pieces of wood that are compressed together in different ways to be able to produce buildings that only create less than 10% the carbon as the equivalent in steel and concrete. And so some things like LVLs that architects have been using for many years, that's a type of mass timber. But there's also cross-laminated timber, or CLT, that are sometimes 3-ply, sometimes 5-ply, and they are now able to make large roofs, large walls, large floors. So we looked at this type of construction, and even though at the time it had not been approved in the state of California, it has been built, a number of buildings in Australia, in Austria, in Germany. And so we visited some of these. We brought in experts who had been doing it in other places, like Michael Green as the architect, and some construction folks and engineers who've been doing them around the globe. And we got to a point where we thought, you know what, this is really interesting. We think we could actually make buildings, whether they be 5-story, 20-story, out of mass timber in a way that would only create 10% the carbon as this equivalent in steel and concrete, but for no more cost and less time, and end up with a beautiful building, which sounds like, oh my gosh, that's the holy grail. That sounds like a fantasy land. But luckily, we had enough data points then. We did prototypes. We did a lot of simulations to come up with strategies, like a kit of parts strategy for our office building, to figure out both in time sequencing as well as material efficiency. That's the least amount of pulp or the least amount of weight. That was another indicator of potential cost that we were able to show it to our vice president of real estate, as well as then ultimately our CFO and CEO, and say, okay, maybe we think there's a there. Maybe we should do a pilot project. And what's great about Google Scale is a pilot project at the time that ended up being a fully functioning 5-story building, 185,000 square feet. And we have now built that project. We built it in 14 weeks with 2 crews of 7 people apiece, because it was all fabricated off-site and then brought to site as exact pieces, each one labeled and put together almost like you would a wooden toy or a piece of, Japanese furniture. And in the end, we designed the equivalent building using standard steel and concrete, and we brought that through construction document level drawing so we could really do an apple-to-apple comparison in a variety of ways, including carbon and cost. And we found that we're only producing 4% the carbon as the equivalent in steel and concrete, which is extraordinary.
Oh, sure. I understand now they're trying to build airport terminals out of mass timber, more and more of this technology, which is essentially making wood as strong as steel, right? That's the basis behind all of this?
Exactly. But using it from fast growing wood and small pieces of wood too. So that way it's not just a heavy timber, but it's the fast growing wood. And by then a lot of it is having the carbon sequestered in the wood. And so if we could just plant tons of trees and keep growing trees and then have those trees sequester the carbon and hold it and build our buildings out of it, it would be fantastic. And so I can't wait for you to see this building because it's so beautiful now when you walk inside of it. It also it feels so good.
Well, we've had fish farming for a century at least.
Yeah.
I'm surprised Google doesn't have like a wood farm somewhere where it's figuring out how to grow trees faster so they can then be part of this mass timber. Like, how do you get a 20-year tree to grow in 4 years? That'd be a good problem for you guys to solve.
I love that problem. I hope someone at Google is working on it. I wouldn't be surprised if they were not, but I hope so. It's a good idea. So yeah, when you come out to California next, you'll have to come and visit the Mass Timber Building.
I will. Now, last question. As the mother of these 50 houses, do people eventually buy the houses and like figure out there's this Michelle Kaufmann somewhere in the distance and try to find you?
Well, good question. Because my website was hacked many years back, which is now, I guess, why it's a fan site, because they tried to sell it back to me for $10,000. And just on principle, I was like, no, I'm not going to buy it back. They made it into a porn site for a while, which was fascinating. But I really was not going to budge because just on principle, no. And so, a lot of people, I think, don't know how to even contact me anymore. But I certainly hope the homes are all out there and doing well. And I hope people are enjoying them and having wonderful lives with their families in them. Someday I want to go and visit them.
Yes. Tell your Aunt Patty to get busy and putting those homes back online and getting a little better data security so it doesn't become a porn site again. Thank you so much for talking with me, Michelle.
Thank you so much. It's so fun to speak with you. Thank you for taking the time to have these conversations. It's so fun.
You might have noticed that Michelle was a little evasive on the subject of blimps. A few weeks after this interview, she let us know that Google formally announced Pathfinder 1, a prototype electric airship longer than 3 Boeing 737s that can carry 4 tons of cargo over many hundreds of miles. There will be tests at Moffett Field in California before it moves to Akron, Ohio for final airworthiness certification. Pathfinder 1 is the largest aircraft to take to the skies since that gargantuan Hindenburg of the 1930s. It blew up because it was fueled by flammable hydrogen. This blimp uses inert helium, where ignition is not a problem, and Google's co-founder, Sergey Brin, hopes these aircraft can be used to deliver humanitarian aid to victims of floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, and hurricanes. Roger Ferris is the founding principal of Roger Ferris and Partners in Stamford, Connecticut. His office is just a stone's throw away from all those great modernist houses in our favorite small town of New Canaan, Connecticut. An alumnus of the Harvard Graduate School of Design,
Go Crimson!
He creates houses for high-profile clients like producer Steven Spielberg and Blackstone chairman and CEO Steven Schwartzman. A dedicated modernist, he lives in a 120-year-old English Tudor that he gutted and turned contemporary on the inside. Extra points, though, he does have a modernist house out in the Hamptons. Here's George's conversation with Roger Ferris, recorded in Roger's conference room in Stamford, Connecticut.
So my first question to you, Roger, is, have you seen the Airstream documentary?
No.
There is one.
I got to see it.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Wow.
It's all about the beginning of the company and how during the 50s and 60s they took these amazing treks through Europe and Africa. I mean, people pulling Airstreams with Buicks through dirt roads and breaking axles, the whole thing.
Wow, I got to see that.
Now, you have one of these?
I had one. I don't currently have one. But I had one for a while, and I've had clients that have had them.
and used them for various outbuildings.
Yeah. It really is a cult, I think.
Yeah, I think it is a cult. It is a cult. And interesting to customize the interiors of them. So there are challenges to it, but it's fun. So I've done some of that. I also know the owner with Thor Industries, I think.
Okay, yes, right.
Peter
Owns it now.
Orthwein's, an old friend and client of mine from years back. So I know something about more the current side of Airstream than the historical.
Did you take long trips on yours, or did you just have it planted in one place?
One place.
Okay.
Yeah. Just as an outbuilding.
Like a guest house,
Yeah,
sort
for
of?
guest houses.
Oh,
exactly. Yeah.
I know people love them for that.
Yeah. If I had an alternative accommodation inside, the guests would prefer to be outside in the Airstream.
Yeah.
It's like a found object, right? People are fascinated with dwelling in or working in or occupying found objects somehow, other than what's typical.
Sure.
I think that's largely the success of Airstream or any mobile home, really, is there's something unique about it and not typical. It gives meaning to dwelling in it some way or another.
I know Clayton Homes, which is one of the biggest mobile home manufacturers in the country, for a while was marketing modernist manufactured homes. And they didn't sell well when they started, but I think they've retooled them somewhat.
Huh. Is that
And
right?
are putting them out now. And they look great.
Wow. Clayton
Homes, built
wow.
in Tennessee.
Wow.
You designed the Bridge Club for Bob Rubin,
Yeah.
Which was on the site of the old Bridgehampton
Racecourse. Yeah.
Right.
Famous road racing course.
Huge piece of property.
Yeah. Today, the course is, I think, a total of 350 acres. And I think originally it was like 500 acres.
Okay.
I think significant that he gave away to open space in order to execute the golf club.
And I understand it's one of the most expensive golf clubs in the world to join?
Well, I mean, that's...
By design, yeah.
Yeah. Most of the clubs out in the east end of Long Island are expensive to join.
Yeah.
Especially the new ones. The older ones, there's never any room for new members. So there's been a market in developing new clubs out there. But yeah, there's a significant price to be paid to become a member. But the majority of that money is returned at the point at which you leave.
Yeah.
So it's kind of keeps you in
An investment
position.
Sort of.
Yeah.
Right. Your club is a remarkable modernist building. Right. There are not that many modernist golf clubhouses in the world.
Right, that's true. Well, not in the United States.
Okay.
There are in Japan and in China, and there are some in Europe. But in America, golf was a conservative institution. I'm using past tense because I don't think it's as conservative today as it was 10 or 20 years ago. Whereas almost a men's club, and it was very typical to have a bar and a dining room, and like you segregate sort of the spaces, and there's sort of a traditional program to a clubhouse. So when we designed the bridge, we threw all the cards in the air. Neither Bob Rubin or myself had anything to do with golf. Neither one of us had golfed. Probably even frowned on it to some extent. It's like, well, it's chasing a white ball around the
Yeah.
But then we started paying more attention to it and getting focused on it. Bob had owned the race course, and so he had alternatives of building single-family homes or this or whatever. And when we started studying the great golf clubs and clubhouses in America, we got focused on it and decided to try and subvert the typical process, the typical program, and try to reinvent it and come up with a clubhouse that's much more open and loft-like and doesn't have all the typical kind of programmatic things. And relative to rules, too, we sort of abandoned there are no rules. Kids are welcome, dogs are welcome, come as you are.
Right.
And we've had members that show up in cutoffs and combat boots.
Yeah.
Perfectly okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So how does the building differ from the traditional kind of tight conservative model that is in most places?
Yeah, well, first it's just everything that's the antithesis of that. So it's not tight, it's not uptight, it's not about a traditional club on any level. So The building response to the site, I don't think it could exist anywhere else. It's one of the highest points, if not the highest point in the east end of Long Island, which most people consider probably flat, but in reality there is elevation at that end. And
it's got such a terrific view. I saw photos taken from that club.
Yeah, we have 280-degree views of the Peconic Bay, Noyac Bay, down to Sag Harbor, out to Long Island Sound, and on a clear day you can actually see Connecticut and Rhode Island. So the views are really spectacular. It's not what people typically think of as the Hamptons. Mm-hmm. The landscape's not all privet and hedges and stuff like that. It's all very natural. So when I first went to the site and walked around with Bob, it was still operating as a vintage race course. You know, we walked around the pits that had more or less been abandoned, and we found an impeller from a turbine wheel from a race car there were parts of cars all over the place. And I started thinking about the views and considering the idea of respecting the history of the land, sort of made what we call blades or individual components that span and look at specific parts of the landscape. So we arranged the clubhouse as part of a turbine wheel, and the front of it's very flat and aligns the 18th green with the first hole, and pays homage to the typical shingle-style porches, wooden porches in the Hamptons, by putting the wood vertically instead of horizontally, and abstracting the porch through a kind of trellis structure. So it acts as the main spine and organizing device, and then the blades all fan out in the back of the clubhouse.
So you can walk in different directions and see different views.
Very much so.
Okay.
And you see the clubhouse from every hole. So looking back at it, it's always sort of there, somewhat taking flight on the hillside.
The only other club that I could easily find in a quick search of the internet was the King Kamehameha Club in Hawaii that Frank Lloyd Wright had designed.
Right.
That also is wonderful and very different.
Right. Yeah, indeed. And Wrightian, right? There is one other one, I believe in Arkansas. Maybe Blackwell or
Marlon Blackwell did one?
Design,
okay.
I believe. Yeah, it's not as adventurous as the bridge.
Okay.
And I think there have been some since we did the bridge that have been built, but I'm not that familiar with them.
In the town I grew up, there was what I thought was a beautiful modernist clubhouse by Matthew Nowitzki, and the members hated it. It had lasted about 30 years. They tore it down and put up something classical with the Greek columns.
Right. It was too anonymous or
too way out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we blended a kind of contemporary form with a familiarity in terms of materials inside that's made this a little warmer and resonates with people in that regard. So it's contemporary, but it's comfortable and not too aggressive.
Yeah. Now, your house, the house you live in most of the time, reminds me a little bit of like Bruce Wayne's stately Wayne Manor from the outside.
Right.
But on the inside, you've got some pretty great stuff. I noticed you had a Zaha Hadid boomerang couch.
Yeah, inside. So I live in a picturesque 1901 Tudor-style house in Connecticut.
Yeah.
But I completely redid the interior of it twice now. And everything is an intervention, a contemporary intervention inside. I like the duality. I like the conversation that goes on between historical and contemporary work. So.
Well, it certainly is beautiful when it's photographed.
Yeah.
Right?
It is. Yeah, it's picturesque, which was a struggle for me. I also have a contemporary house out in Bridgehampton, so that gives me a little bit of relief from it. But I appreciate great architecture, whether it's historical or contemporary, or if it's good, it's worthy of appreciation and study and enjoyment.
Now, initially, Bob Rubin told me that he didn't really want to do much residence work out there, but more recently, you are designing some houses for the course.
Right. Well, there are maybe 20 lots. There are a couple of houses built, one of which I designed, and we're building another one right now. He doesn't want it to just develop suddenly. He's happy to do it over the fullness of time. So we are working on contemporary homes now that are referential, at least materialistically to the main clubhouse.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
So there'll be some sort of recognition one building of the
Yeah,
other.
you'll understand the dialogue between them. But it's referential. We're not copying
Right.
literally, but trying to be referential to materials and stuff.
Now, out in L.A., the houses seem to be just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You're getting the 10,000-foot mark, the 15,000, the 20,000. Now, these houses are going up in there 20, 25,000.
Right.
A couple of years ago, you commented that you thought that tide had turned somewhat. Has it, or are they still getting bigger?
No, I'd say it's turned.
Okay.
Everyone is, in my sphere, focused on smaller, high quality. That's relative term, right? So if you're a family of 6, the house isn't going to be 3,000 square feet. They're going to want 6,000 or 8,000 or whatever. But historically, we would do homes that were 15,000 or 20,000 square feet. I don't see that as much anymore. I think people look for the spaces they really want to dwell in, and they're focused on those being proportionately adequate, and they'll only build what they really need. And I urge the people to do that, clearly. I mean, we're always pushing to do less in terms of square footage.
Have you designed any houses on really small lots, like little jewel box houses?
Yeah. So I recently finished a house it's a pink house that's part of a pool. We did an above-ground pool, and it's really a house, like 1,200 square feet approximately. And I think that's all anybody needs to live in. So that's a great joy to have had a project with something that's that small. And it relates to an above-ground pool that we'd built previously, and then we built this house to come up next to it, but it's on its own separate property.
So this is a guest house, essentially,
it's
for
a
the pool.
guest house, but could be sold as a separate house.
As a separate house, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I know that when I talk with the public, one of the metrics that runs around in their head is that they want to be in a house where they can love it, but they can love every room, where they are in every room every day.
Right.
And so many of the developer houses that are out there, you have rooms people just don't use.
You'll never go in them
at all.
Yeah. But somehow you feel inadequate if you don't have them, even though you don't use them. Yeah. I think in the contemporary idiom within which we practice in the design process are really questioning what are the spaces you live in, how do you live. We allow ourselves to be subsumed by our clients and really understand how they live, how they dwell, what their expectations are, what's meaningful about a home.
Now, do you do the old Richard Neutra thing and go spend the weekend with them in the house?
Some.
Yeah?
Yeah. Some people embrace that idea. Others are a little frightened by that notion, at least initially. But you always become friendly with your clients at the end of the journey, right? 2 or 3 years later.
They wake up in the morning and this random architect is coming down the stairs.
Yeah, some embrace it. If they've done it before, not that they've had architects move in with them, but if they built something before, they understand why that would be relevant.
Yeah.
And I think it's informative for architects to do that as much as it is for clients, because you see things differently with every perspective that somebody has about how they want to live.
Yeah. Now, you do lots of other projects besides houses, too. You do condos and office projects, and you've done a project at Hudson Yards, right?
Yeah. Well, we've designed a skyscraper there that's just about to go through the regulatory process in the city. No, we've managed to be typologically diverse. I think the residential work we do is stronger because we've done commercial work and understand how we can build with steel and concrete and materials that you might not typically find in a residential practice. But what we learn about scale and space and volume informs our commercial work. So I think it goes both ways.
Roger, what's your favorite Sinatra tune?
My favorite Sinatra tune is New York.
New York, New York?
Yeah.
Yeah? Could you sing a few bars? Because I know you can.
No, I can't. I have a horrible voice.
Really?
Yeah.
So I've seen that you've talked about being a lounge singer. Is this a shower aspiration where you're taking a shower and you're...
It is totally a farce and something that I tell people because it is exactly what I'm incapable of doing.
Well, I was hoping we could
Where
get a
did you
little
find
solo.
that? I'm surprised you did some digging to find that one.
Yes.
Right.
Our research staff is pretty good.
Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
So you've been doing this now, what, 35 years since you left Harvard?
About 35 years.
Okay.
I don't like to count years. I count by projects.
How many projects?
And well, it's more the distance between when you start to imagine them initially and they actually get built, which is one of the benefits of having residential work in a firm, because you can see it materialize. It actually happens in a relatively short period of time, 2, maybe 3 years, whereas some of our commercial work can be like 5, 10 years before it actually is complete.
Yeah, it takes a while.
Yeah. And then you're not happy with it because you've moved on.
Have you had a building yet be destroyed that you designed?
No.
No?
I had a restaurant in our past. We'd won a James Beard Award for restaurant design, which I didn't know anything about prior to doing. It was the first restaurant I ever designed. And I found it an interesting site for architecture, right? Restaurants, because you have a captive audience for a period of time. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, like they're there for an hour, hour and a half, whatever it is. And we were able to create a lot of interesting details. We actually did the artwork, and it was a textual piece of art that we did on the wall that would throw.
Kind of like the old chart house restaurants. They were very sculpted as well.
Yeah, right. You were there and you could enjoy detail looking around and whatever, but as the chef and the owner ultimately fought, they sold it and tore it down within like 14 months, and it was devastating to see. So I don't do restaurants anymore, but I haven't had any actual houses or buildings torn apart.
Oh, that's good, because it's a very sobering moment for people when that happens.
I hope I'm not around to see it.
Have you been in a situation yet where you've had to consider or actually tear down a house by another noted architect to build your project?
We have, not by noted architects, but we have, as land is relatively scarce in the Northeast, often we're in a position where something has to be demolished in order to create something else. But it would be hard for me to do that on anything that was significant. And
because I know there are a lot of Norman Jaffe houses that have either been destroyed or are pending in the Hamptons.
Right, which is tragic. No, in fact, I have restored a Norman Jaffe house, a small one, but and it was a labor of love to have researched, found the original drawings, looked at the intentions that Norman had at the time, and we were able to embellish it as he would have with more contemporary materials on the inside, and that was a learning experience, right? And it typically is, even when we've restored historical buildings, great historical buildings, where we're tearing something apart and looking at how it was framed and how it was constructed, and it's educational and inspiring. So I like to do that, whether it's modernist or historical.
Well, Roger, thank you so much for talking to me. I hope one day we can see you open, say, for Michael Feinstein.
Right. I'll get together with my voice coach and see if I can come back with something.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun.
For most of his career, Ron Melk was one of those advertising agency executives made famous by the TV series Mad Men, and he has extensive background in advertising, promotion, and producing award-winning radio and TV programming. Kevin Kennedy is an award-winning contractor of over 30 years, featured on the cover of Fine Home Building magazine. For 7 years, Ron and Kevin were the voices of the popular Philadelphia radio program Your Valuable Home, which in 2020 became a podcast, bringing their listeners insights, horror stories, and expert interviews about buying and holding on to property to build wealth. Here's George's conversation with Ron and Kevin.
Ron, before we get started talking about architecture and houses, you're a madman, aren't you? You're old-time ad man, advertising, martinis, the whole bit, right?
I don't know about the martinis. The answer to that is yes, yes, and yes. That goes back quite a few years. I was in New York for 23 years, worked for a couple big agencies as a writer. and then as a account supervisor, and then was recruited into a promotion agency. It was the better part of my career. It was wonderful. We had a lot of good clients, did a lot of wonderful things. We were named the best promotion agency in the country by Advertising Age magazine. And it was just a wonderful experience for me. But after 23 years of getting up and getting on the train every morning, it was enough.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, were there any like famous jingles you wrote, like "Good to the Last Drop" or something like that in your career?
No, I did. Even though I was in account work, I did write a couple of really good jingles. I did one for a harness racing track in West Virginia. I did a couple of them. My claim to fame down here, after I left there in Bucks County, I've been working out of Bucks County since then, has really been long form TV and radio.
Okay.
A lot of that. Did a lot of radio in New York too. Radio commercials.
The two of you started your podcast as a radio show on the local station there. When was that?
Oh, that, by the way, we hit a milestone in March. It'll be 11 years in March. 11 years.
Awesome.
7 on radio, 3 different stations. And the last one we were on was 1210. It's the big boy talk station in Philadelphia. And we were there for a year and then decided to go into podcasting because the numbers in AM radio, you can't really get good numbers in non-rated radio. We get good numbers. We use Blueberry, and you can tell as soon as the numbers start coming in, you can tell what moves the needle, which is something I use every week to gear what content we're going to put on.
How did the two of you meet?
Brad, you want to take that one?
But Ron and I, we actually had, there's a few different ideas that we were talking about with meeting, but it was one of my customers that was a very good friend of Ron's. And I always said to this gentleman that I was meeting with, Dennis was his name, I said, I always wanted to get into TV and radio. I said, I've just been blessed that I'm doing so much in the construction industry. I just would love to do something. He said, I know somebody. And he said,
I know a guy, yeah.
I know a guy who knows a guy, yeah.
Who happened to know a guy. And it worked out. And Ron, I remember that phone call when we first got together. We actually met at Starbucks in Newtown. And I'm figuring, this is no way going to happen. We're never going to get this off. And I can't believe how well it blossomed over the past 10 and a half years and how well the show's gone and how well it's doing. But yeah, it was a guy. That's what you can say. It was a guy that introduced us.
What was your first show, Kevin?
Well, me not going to any communication school or any forms of communication, Ron said, hey, listen, just get in front of it, just start talking. You could do that the best. But it was a little nerve-wracking because I'd never done any radio before. Yeah. And Ron is the expert. Ron can write anything you want him to do. But talking on the radio, because I don't see anybody, I don't get to see the reaction. So the first show we talked about, I remember it was one of my good customers that came on and we talked about our kitchen. At that time, it was just me talking. And I tell you, after doing a show for an hour, it really, it was taking a toll on me. And then it was probably maybe around about 6 months after that, we went to partner up talking together.
Did the frickin' frack thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it worked. It worked better. It worked much better. So we have a system in place now that really does work because it allows us to be fresh throughout the whole hour of the show that we're doing it. Me doing the replays and horror stories, Ron doing the colleges. It works out. And then in between those segments, Ron will jump in the replay and horror, and then I'll jump in every once in a while with the college. And it works. It just works.
Well, let's explain more to our listeners what these segments are. Ron, take us through kind of the order of events in a typical podcast.
We lead in with what's called the replay. It's usually a project that Kevin either knows about or is working on. And then we track it. We track the progress of the project. So that lasts about 10 to 15 minutes. Then we do what's called the horror story. And everybody, you probably have one too, George, of hiring a contractor. And next thing you know, your house is all ripped apart and you're pulling your hair out. We do that every week. And then third week of the month, we get contributing stories from the Bucks County DA's office and consumer protection here. And we call it the Bad Guy Bulletin. We cover everything from telephone scams to email scams. And Lord knows there is no shortage of material there. There's always something. And with AI now, it's going to only get worse. And then I do the feature segment, which is really based on the philosophy that our mission is to help homeowners and residential real estate investors build wealth with real estate, but also to make the most of their communities. So we cover stories that you won't hear on a typical home improvement show. I'll give you a couple of examples. We just did one on hazardous dead trees of two varieties, ash trees and oak trees. They're both infected by different things. And then the other problem with trees that's killing trees is the violent weather that we've been having. Anything that's growing on a slope or on a creek bed or a riverbed, the downside of it, the roots have been washed away. So you got big trees that are coming down. So we did this show with an arborist and a attorney who specializes in municipal law and tree law, believe it or not. And we set a record for downloads with that show, which shows that people it motivates people. They want to hear about it. So we're planning a follow-up right now where we're going out and actually track like 2 miles of roadway in Bucks County and show the trees and talk about the trees and say this tree should be listed as a hazard tree and it should come down. They'll kill people. We've had a couple of people killed in Bucks County because of it.
So in a sense, you're going to be branching out.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
Okay, good.
Out, yeah.
Okay.
Well, we've also covered, and we have a number of organizations that are continuing guests on the show. The Pew Charitable Trust, they're marshaling forces to preserve 1 million acres of salt marsh up and down the Atlantic coast, and that includes North Carolina, which is a first line of defense against rising seas. So we've done that. We cover the study that the National Association of Realtors does every year, looking at the market for the coming year. We have produced a 5-show series for YouTube called The Coolest Neighborhoods in America.
Mm-hmm,
and
yes.
2 of them, big mod. One was Palm Springs, where you and I met.
Yes.
And the other one, believe it or not, was Philadelphia. I didn't know about North Carolina. Maybe we'll do the 6th
There you go.
coolest neighborhood in America, in North Carolina. But that was a real labor of love, and we got 30,000 looks on that with that series. So we're very gratifying.
Now, Kevin, when you are building a new house or renovating one, a lot of people, even who have traditional houses, want modernist features in them. What are some of the modern things that people want in their houses?
Well, that's what I've been selling for probably the last 20-some years, because I've always liked the modernist house. I like the open concept. I like the large windows. So all the homes that I go into there, implementing a design idea that works is taking all the walls out in the middle of the house, because around in Bucks County, where we're from, there are a lot of homes that have smaller rooms that were built. So what we wanted to do is give that open concept in and outside the house. I've worked with a bunch of manufacturers over the years, getting larger windows, making windows that are large enough that can handle the spans that we try to put in, which is 5, 6, 7 feet back years ago. Now, technology today has made it even easier that we're putting windows in that are combined total of about 15 to 20 feet wide. Multiples, but we're been doing that for years. People love that concept. So it's not one job. It's almost every job that I do has some form of technology that we can put it in to give it that open air concept feeling with large windows, so you can get the visual being inside and outside beauty of the house or the project that we're doing.
And I know that there's always a trend. Like years ago, it was granite countertops, and then people wanted concrete floors. I mean, all these kinds of things. What are some of the trends you're seeing now that people are wanting in their homes?
Well, here's one of the trends that is starting to come back in this area is vibrant brush bronze color. It's not a brass color, but it's a darker brass matted finish, and it's coming back.
That was an 80s thing, right?
Yes, it was. Yeah, and now it's coming back. I'm not sure a bunch of your listeners that are designers are probably going, oh, no, that's not going to happen. I mean, everybody's got their theories of design. We're thinking wallpaper is going to be a great design, but what I'd like to do is work off the beauty of what a homeowner wants. Let the homeowner choose on what they want to design. And I just help them through the process of doing that. That's why the replay is so interesting, because some of the customers that I do have that come on the show announce that they're talking about doing something that's never been done before. We were launching products for a lot of window companies, siding companies that nobody in the country has ever done before. And that's where I was getting a lot of my design concepts and ideas from these other manufacturers that allowed me to introduce their products to the market across America.
Now, Kevin, is the material shortage over from the pandemic? I mean, can you get everything that you need within a reasonable time frame, or are there still things it's hard and time consuming to get?
On the East Coast, from the context that I do have in my personal experiences, we are back to normal.
Okay.
COVID was a mess for us. We couldn't get any products. Anything vinyl, petroleum-based was almost obsolete for about 6 months. Everything today is back on schedule with a lot of the manufacturers.
Ron, in producing the show, since you're an ad man from way back, what do you do to get the word out about your podcast?
Oh, to tell you the truth, what we do is work with the people who we have on the show. And we've had a lot of very, very high level people from different companies and different organizations, i.e. the Department of Energy. We had 4 top people from the Department of Energy on recently talking about nukes, wind, solar, and hydrogen. Okay. And
so this
it
was about power sources, not bombs. Okay, I'm just following along here.
Definitely
I like what
about
he said,
power
nukes.
sources. We probably won't ever get into bombs. No, power sources. But what we do is rely on those people then and often provide them with their segment that they did, and they blow it out in social media. We really haven't spent a lot of money to promote it. It's all been sort of organic.
Okay.
And I'm sure you do the same thing. And it works. It really works. You can see the bumps in the numbers when you have people on who really cooperate in that regard.
Now, Kevin, when you have a new client approach you about a house, typically they're not going to be experienced in building a house. They're going to be new. Maybe some people have done it before. So what makes for you an ideal client? What should they know or have a little research in before they come to you so they're better prepared to have the conversation to build a new house?
It's a great question. What I say starting out with, of course, and all the contractors are going to love what I have to say right now, is patience. Have the patience to work with your contractor. That's number one. But my typical client is, whether you're experienced or not, we're going to educate you first. So even if you're price shopping and you're going with a couple of different contractors trying to figure out who you're going to use, my philosophy is I'm going to educate you first. I want you understanding exactly what we're doing, how the price has been generated. If there is any questions that you should be asking, I'm going to even ask those questions for you so you understand exactly where I'm coming from, whether it's going to be a project or a new home that we're building or an addition, because surprises, people don't like surprises. So I try to give them as much information as possible from the beginning so they don't have that guessing game going on of what the expectation for me is and what I'm going to offer them.
One of the contractors I spoke to one time said that he tried to imagine it like a game show and that he would tell the clients in advance, there are going to be 2 times you're going to be badly surprised during the game show. I can't tell you when that's going to be, but they're going to be at least twice. Maybe you could do that with your clients. Then they know to expect
It's like a Monty Halls.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Monty Halls, let's make a deal. Pick a door when you open it up. That's going to be the surprise that we're going to be doing.
Yeah, exactly.
But, yeah, I tell you, if you don't give the surprises with a lot of my clients, the job goes so much easier. And listen, I don't advertise. I don't do any social media beside the show, Your Valuable Home. I just keep off the radar. I've been very blessed over the past 34 years on what I did in the industry. I don't know if we ever talked about like Fine Home Building magazine. We've been on the cover twice, September 2006, Best of Edition, summer 2007, launching products for a lot of multiple companies. My job's been seen on VH1 twice. National News Brief did 2 articles with me on 2004 and 2005. The Wall Street Journal, This Old House magazine, which led us into Tom Silva endorsing us back this past April. So that has a lot of credibility. But here's one of the things that I do that not many people can say they do. For the past 34 years, I'm the one physically doing your work. So when it comes to the framing, Dave and I, it's my foreman. He's the guy on the cover, the first cover in September 2006 of Fine Home Building. They said my head was getting too big, so they put him on the cover. I thought this was going to be one of the greatest things. The guy says, hey, listen, when I send you the magazine before it comes out, make sure your wife and your foreman are there because I want to see your reaction that your wife sees when you open the magazine. This is a national magazine cover. As I'm pulling it out, I just see Dave starting to laugh. It's my foreman, Dave, on the cover. And I'm going, what are you doing? He's like, well, win another award and maybe I'll put you on the cover again, which led me to get my second national cover. But it was kind of a humbling experience in my business.
There you go.
But it sure does add up when today that everybody's about what Ron and I say on the show is S&S, salesmen and subs. Mm-hmm. That's the going thing today. Everybody has a salesman and sub and the owners aren't working on the job. And I'm not faulting anybody for their kind of work. Is that in 1996, I was like them. I was running 13 crews. I was driving around just fixing mistakes and I just didn't want to do it anymore. If we're doing your addition, Dave and I are doing the framing. Dave and I are doing the siding. We're doing the windows. We're doing the cabinet installing. We're doing the trim. We're doing the painting. That's what people want to see anymore. And the trend's going back to that way because everybody's about, let's get the job. We're going to do it. You're going to start and you're going to finish. Here's one thing that I've been told is that when I do your job, I don't take any money. When I start your job, I don't take any money. When I'm probably about a third of the way done, I might take some money because I want that trust factor to be built up with you and I that you're going to understand where I'm coming from. There's going to be no surprises. And what I said from the beginning is going to be true all the way through the job until the end. And if you can do that, and this is what we implement on the show, I say this is one of the things on how to pick the right contractor. It works. People do trust you at that point because, hey, look, you take the TV, the radio, the podcast, and magazine covers out of the equation. If I don't take your money, you're going to build up a lot more trust with me than somebody that has it and wants all your money up front.
Let's talk about some specific problems of modernist houses, roofs and beams. So one of the myths of modernism is that all flat roofs leak. It turns out that's not true. A lot of them leak, but not all of them. Have you had to repair a flat roof before?
Ryan, have you ever repaired a flat roof?
Well, no. Actually, we're going to be doing it. I have a rental in Philadelphia. It's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath condo, and it's a nightmare. And it's got a flat roof that's been leaking like a sieve. Not because flat roofs are bad, but because the guy who built the place, I don't know, whoever did it didn't seem to know what they were doing. We've had all sorts of problems with the bill. It's in litigation right now.
Okay.
So I've been through the flat roof thing, and then we've had a guy on a couple times. John, remember John?
Yep.
He's a roofer. Most of his business in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is a flat roof kind of town.
Yeah.
And he's got a lot of experience doing that sort of thing.
And they're putting on rubber membrane roofs, I assume, as replacements.
Yes.
For old gravel and asphalt and various materials.
Yeah. And that's probably what we're going to get into. It's undoubtedly what we're going to get into when we redo this building in Philadelphia. Okay. It's a 9-unit building. And the top floors, I don't have a lot of problems in my unit because I'm down. But the apartments right underneath the penthouse have taken on a lot of water.
And Kevin, what about post and beam type construction? When those houses age, get over 30, 40 years, sometimes there can be water damage on the beams. And how do you go about repairing or replacing those?
Carefully, very carefully. If you don't know what you're doing with a lot of the beams and posts that are in place, you could have a total collapse of a section of a house or the entire house. And what I tell people, from flat roofs all the way down to anything you're going to be doing, if any job is done correctly from the beginning, you're never going to have a problem. And that's what I try to instill is that don't make shortcuts. Flat roofs are definitely not an issue problem. I know when people always say, well, flat roofs leak. Well, I think it's a nomenclature of how people think of those roofs, because if the roof was done right from the beginning, you would never have this problem. I'll give you an example, stucco. Everybody thinks stucco is the worst thing possible out there in this Northeast region. But I said, if I do your prep work, you'll never have a problem, because 99% of the time that I've seen around here is with improper installation of the windows, the flashing. I've seen a couple of times they put their underlayments upside down, which again, that's human error on that one. But a lot of the issues, whether if you're going to be post and beam or if you're going to be a flat roof, if it's done correctly from the beginning and knowing what you're doing, because the post and beam, you just don't start taking out the post and expecting that beam to still stay there. That's like the game of Jenga. Once you pull something out, you better know that you're going to be supported throughout the rest of the area to hold that beam in place, because if you don't, it's catastrophic. And that's what we don't want to see. So you really need to hire somebody very experienced when it comes to the post and beam situations, because a lot of the jobs that we're doing, taking the walls out, the interior part of the walls, if you don't do that correctly and support it correctly, you're going to have a little bit of an issue.
Yeah, a big issue.
Big issue. Yeah.
You got that right.
Not a little issue.
Could be a deadly issue. Yeah, absolutely.
One job we just recently did, it was probably on a show starting in August, and it was a job where a lady called me up and she was having a lot of issues. Guy took the money and ran, basically what he did. And I got there and it was a 30-foot beam that was in place. And I noticed the plywood on the floor was starting to settle. And I just said, can we go outside? Because I have a feeling that any more weight gets on this house above this beam, it's going to drop. So what these contractors did is they put the wrong size beam in, then they finally got the right size beam, but you still need to support the beam. And he had no continuous footing. Now, what that means is you're coming from the basement with a haunch footing and having supports from that basement floor all the way up to where that beam is. They had the beam and post sitting on plywood. And I said to the homeowner, when the drywall gets installed, this second floor becomes your first floor, and your first floor is in your basement.
Yeah.
So that's how important it is. A lot of people that I've dealt with fixing their problems don't know what they're doing.
Well, if you want to downsize, that's a quick way to do it.
That is true. I've always wanted the answer. Well, we're going to give you one.
The podcast is Your Valuable Home, Ron and Kevin, thanks so much for joining me.
And thank you. And thanks for coming on our show. I mean, it was a wonderful interview, and we'll do it again, George. Do it again.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle Square Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Malibu, Toronto, Los Angeles, and Palm Springs.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Kelly Policelli handles guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.